Hi everyone, I am reading the next chapter in Global Woman, Nannies, Maids, and Sex Workers in the New Economy by Arlie Russell Hochschild. And this chapter is called Blow-Ups and Other Unhappy Endings by Pierrette Hondagno Sotelo. So let's just get started. A conflict begins over a mundane issue, a seemingly misspent hour, a seemingly sharp word. Quickly the confrontation flares, exploding into a screaming match. Both women say harsh, regrettable things that reveal deep antipathies, which perhaps always lurked unspoken between them. It is as though the previously invisible fissures in their relationship were suddenly magnified and projected into plain view. The domestic worker is fired, or she walks out in disgust. It's a dramatic way to end a job, but not an uncommon one for domestic workers who often spend months or years in daily contact with the most intimate aspects of their employers' lives. Most commonly, blow-ups result from a lack of trust or respect between mistress and maid, surveillance on the part of the employer, perceived insubordination on the part of the worker, or a feeling of betrayal on either side. Of course, not all domestic jobs end in blow-ups, but even less combustible arrangements often end up more the way relationships do than the way jobs do, with white lies or alibis, designed to spare feelings or avoid conflict. Often, both parties know that the real reason an employee leaves is not a sick relative or a return to her home country. Like estranged partners, they tacitly agree not to discuss the tensions that rendered their relationship unworkable. But far from being partners, the two women occupy vastly unequal social roles. The worker keeps her silence out of fear, the employer out of guilt, diffidence, or indifference. What follow are stories culled from interviews I conducted with nearly 70 Latina immigrant domestic workers and their employers in Los Angeles County during the mid to late 1990s. Nearly every live-in maid or nanny recounted at least one blow-up in her career. Employers were less forthcoming with tales of such confrontations. Nonetheless, a close look at how domestic jobs end from the perspective of the workers, if not the employers, tells us a great deal about how they begin and how the profession is organized. It also exposes the degree to which domestic labor is viewed as something other than real work. Blow-ups. By the time Soraya Sanchez had lived and worked at the Brooks family's 3-story home for 2 months, caring for 3 young children, she was already dissatisfied. Her hours were too long, she was required to sleep with the children when the parents stayed out late, and her relationships were rocky with both Mrs. Brooks and the family's 7-year-old child, whom Soraya found manipulative and disobedient. Her previous jobs, which were relatively upscale nanny and housekeeper positions, had never demanded that she work major holidays, but the Brooks family coaxed Soraya into accompanying them to a relative's home in Seattle for Thanksgiving. There, things went from bad to worse. After the catered Thanksgiving dinner, the Brooks' 7-year-old told her mother that Soraya had screamed at her to keep quiet while she put the baby to bed. The senora had been drinking a bit too much at the Thanksgiving dinner, Soraya recalls. I can't find another explanation because she came into the baby's room, opened the door, and started yelling at me, saying, "How dare you speak that way to my child?" I was yelling so exaggeratedly loud that I had to be quiet. She was yelling, "I don't know who you think you are. I've been going out of my way for you." And I said, "Justine, you don't go out of the way for nobody, not even your mother." Because she didn't. You don't go out of the way for nobody but yourself. When Mrs. Brooks told Soraya she was fired, Soraya replied, "You know what? You don't have to fire me. I won't work for you. Not for $1 million. I'm quitting. You know what? Now I'm no longer your maid, and you're no longer my boss, and you and I are equals. Now you're going to hear what I'm going to say to you." What Soraya had to say was this: "You're the mother, and not even you want to take care of your own children. Why I should have to worry? I hope that you find a person who really understands your children, because not even you know how to understand them. I quit, I'm quitting, I'm quitting." With that, Soraya packed her things and stormed out of the house. Finding herself alone in a strange city, she took a taxi to the airport and waited there for a morning flight home to Los Angeles. The work week began as usual for Elvira Areola. Early Monday morning, she arrived at the Johnston family's white picket-fenced suburban home. She had worked there for 11 years, initially cleaning the Johnstons' home once or twice a week while also working in a plant nursery. When Dr. Johnston and his wife adopted their first child 4 years ago, they persuaded Elvira to work for them full-time. As a live-out nanny and housekeeper, she worked 4 10-hour days a week. Elvira cared for a newly adopted baby as well as the 4-year-old boy, who now attended nursery school 2 mornings a week. She was also in charge of the upkeep of the Johnston sprawling house, which included 5 bathrooms and many delicate antiques. That Monday morning, Elvira took the baby for a walk as she had been instructed to do, and visited, as she often did, with a nanny who worked in another home in the neighborhood. As Elvira tells it, Mrs. Johnston tracked her down and told her in a raised voice that she had been frantically telephoning in search of her and the baby. Accusing Elvira of not having brought enough food for the baby, Mrs. Johnson immediately took the baby home herself. Silence descended between them for the remainder of the day, but that wasn't all that unusual. According to Elvira, although they were almost always the only two adults in the house, they rarely spoke. Often Mrs. Johnston stayed in her bedroom alone until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But that Monday silence was pregnant with the resentment both women felt after the incident on the street. Elvira bristled most at Mrs. Johnston's distrust. It didn't help, however, that she was already quietly smoldering over the increase in her workload that had accompanied the second adoption. Monday mornings, when the boy was in preschool, had previously been Elvira's house cleaning time. She now spent that day caring for the new baby. She knew from friends who worked in neighboring homes that in some households, a weekly or bi-weekly house cleaner helps pick up the slack for overloaded nannies. Mrs. Johnson, however, no doubt saw an idle employee neglecting her house cleaning duties and perhaps even the baby's diet in order to socialize. Elvira was being paid to take care of the Johnson house and the children. Mrs. Johnson admonished her not to visit with nearby nannies. When Elvira returned to the job on Wednesday, Mrs. Johnson took her aside, accused her of having left the house for 5 hours, and told her to be more responsible. "You're just like one of our family," she said. "No, she wasn't," Elvira replied. "She had her own family, and in any case, one didn't treat one's family in this manner." "Remember, you're just a maid," retorted Mrs. Johnston. When Mr. Johnston drove Elvira home that evening, he asked her to apologize to his wife. Elvira passed a restless night, wondered if she should quit. She decided to stay and to act civilly, but not to apologize because she felt she'd done nothing wrong. On Friday, Mrs. Johnston told Elvira to take the boy to the library for story time, and then to meet her at McDonald's, where she would hand over the baby so that Elvira might walk home with both children. Elvira waited at McDonald's for several hours. Her employer never arrived. Later that afternoon, Elvira told Mrs. Johnson she was quitting. "Rethink this. You can't quit," said Mrs. Johnston. Elvira held fast. Mrs. Johnson asked her to put her resignation in writing, but Elvira could not write in English, and Mrs. Johnson knew it. The woman traded insults. Mrs. Johnston, a large woman by Elvira's account, attempted to block the doorway, but eventually Elvira slipped past. Downstairs, Mr. Johnson, oblivious to the blow-up between the two women, asked, "Elvira, can you please take out the garbage before you leave?" She complied, gathered her purse and sweater, and then walked out of the house for the last time, leaving her employers of 11 years and the 4-year-old boy whom she had helped raise since infancy. Elvira expected she would soon feel sad and remorseful. To her surprise, however, she felt only joyful and relieved. "I thought maybe I wouldn't even feel like searching for a new job, that I'd be depressed, but no, I felt really great." She had only one regret. She longed to see the little boy she had cared for, but she knew that if she called or visited him, his parents might construe her presence as malicious, or as an attempt to kidnap their son. A single mother of 4, Elvira had her hands full with her job search in any event. "I haven't rested one day," she says. "There's not been one day when I haven't gone out searching for work." Without references, Elvira's job hunt was certainly challenging. She spent her days walking the streets of Pasadena and other cities in the San Gabriel Valley, looking into jobs at plant nurseries, motels, hospitals, shops, and convalescent homes. She left crudely drawn, hand-printed cards advertising her house cleaning services on doorsteps in a middle-class neighborhood, but no one called to inquire. Finally, after weeks of searching, Elvira was hired for the night shift on a hospital cleaning crew. She still hoped to pick up a few houses to clean during the week. Her pay at the Johnsons had come to approximately $8 an hour, which placed her at the upper end of her occupation's wage scale. At her new job, she would earn only the minimum wage, then $4.25. She was ashamed of the low pay and the odd hours, but was optimistic that she should soon do better. What's more, she felt strongly that her dignity was worth the pay cut. "What matters to me most is feeling good, seeing that they like my work," she maintains. "Money is important for material things. I know that without money you've got nothing, but I can't expect to earn the same as I was before." Candace Ross is the cheerful 36-year-old wife of a CEO. The mother of 3 young children, she recently quit her job as a mid-level manager in order to spend more time with her family. That changed things for Carmen, her Salvadoran live-in nanny and housekeeper. As Mrs. Ross recalls, Carmen's life got a lot easier. "I'm very neat and tidy, and I do a lot." As far as Mrs. Ross could see, Carmen's job was now reduced to watching the baby when she went out. She was therefore stunned when Carmen chose that time to ask for a raise. After consulting with her husband, Mrs. Ross decided to consent to a raise, but on the condition that Carmen's duties expand to regular Friday and Saturday night babysitting. Carmen initially consented but later objected since the new schedule would interfere with her Saturday morning ESL classes. We kind of had a blow up, and then she started acting really inconsiderate about her position, in my opinion, recalls Mrs. Ross. She said, well, you've never given me a bonus. And I thought, a bonus? I worked all my work years and I never got a bonus from my employer at all. I don't know where she even got that idea. I just felt really bad and I said, gosh, it's apparent that you don't appreciate what you have here. I try to have a nice house for you to live in and I never asked you to do something that I wouldn't do myself. I said, you say that I didn't give you a bonus. Well, why don't you take back all those Christmas presents I gave you and cash them in? There's your bonus. That kind of thing. I said, is money just really all that's important to you? Indeed, it was a suggestion that Carmen was motivated as much by her wages as by love for the Ross children that stung her employer most. I was really hurt, Candace Ross concedes, and I probably said some things to her that I wish I could take back. The worst of the things the employer said was that she no longer needed a nanny 5 days a week, and that she was only keeping Carmen out of pity. I said, so if you want to, go ahead and just leave. Go ahead, and I'll try to find somebody to come in 2 or 3 days a week. Later, Carmen came to her boss, and the women were able to mend their relationship. They came up with a new arrangement whereby Carmen would work for the Ross family 3 days a week and work the other 2 days elsewhere, cleaning houses in the same exclusive residential neighborhood. Carmen remains Candace Ross's live-in, which allows her to save on rent and to send money to her own children in El Salvador. But she now has several employers, which means she is no longer solely dependent on what she earns in the Ross household. Margarita Gutierrez, a young woman from Mexico City, worked as a live-in nanny and housekeeper. When she decided to leave her job, she gave her employer 2 weeks' notice, a rare courtesy in this realm of employment. The weeks passed, but the night before what was to have been her last day, the couple came knocking on Margarita's bedroom door. Here's your money, they told her. You can go now. Unexpectedly cast out of her home and job a day early, Margarita called her sister, who also worked as a live-in maid and nanny. Margarita waited outside in the Canyon Home's dark driveway for a ride to her sister's employer's home. Although several years have passed since this incident, she still cries as she tells the story. Celestina Vitriola lived a middle-class life in El Salvador, but when she came to the United States, she took a job with the family as a Monday through Friday live-out nanny and housekeeper. 2 years later, the family asked her to move in. Celestina said no. She was taking evening classes at an adult school, and she was living with her boyfriend. The family fired her on the spot with 1 week severance pay. They didn't even give me time to say, well, let me think about it, or to find another job. They let me go that same day, she recalls. For Celestina, the shock was compounded by the fact that she was abruptly forced to part with the 2-year-old she had tended since birth and whom she had grown to love. I said to myself, I'll never work in a house again, and I'll never take care of a child again. Celestina recounts, you get to feeling a lot of attachment for these children. It really hurt me that they took me out like that so suddenly. So I said, no, I'll never take care of a house or children again. Like many vows made in the heat of the moment, Celestina's was a hard one to keep, especially given the scarcity of jobs open for recent immigrants. She took a job on a catering truck, preparing and selling lunches to Latino factory workers, but before long she was laid off. That was when she decided to return to domestic work, accepting another position as a live-out nanny and housekeeper. In order to make her peace with this decision, she drew some protective boundaries with her new employer. From the beginning, I told her, you know what, if you decide to get rid of me someday, tell me 3 months ahead of time. Don't tell me one day to the next, and I'll do the same. I'll give you plenty of time to find a replacement person. But to this day, 6 years later, I still work for her. Ronalda Saavedras, a young Salvadoran nanny and housekeeper, has seen several jobs and explosively. Once an employer accused her of torturing and killing the family's cat. She was fired on this basis despite her claim that the cat had wandered into a nearby canyon where a coyote probably ate it. A previous employer in Beverly Hills, in a fit of rage, fired Ronalda and 3 other domestic employees en masse. That didn't stop Ronalda from taking another job in a multiple employee household, however. She worked for several months as one of 2 daily live-out nannies and housekeepers in an upscale home in Los Angeles, his West Side. It took no longer than that for a conflict to brew. One Saturday, Ronalda's employer confronted her with a litany of complaints and abruptly fired her. According to the employer, Ronalda was a bad driver, an indulgent nanny, an insubordinate employee, and inattentive to her job. Ronalda says heard about none of these failings until the moment she was fired. After that, the young woman resolved not to seek another job as a nanny and housekeeper, but to work instead as a weekly house cleaner. She was well situated to make the switch. She was relatively young, with good physical stamina. Her English was rapidly improving. She had a car, and she had an aunt in the house cleaning business who could help her gain a foothold. Within a year, she'd established a viable route of houses to clean. The work was physically demanding and exhausting, but to Ronalda it was infinitely preferable to the emotional vulnerability she felt as a nanny and housekeeper. Sarah Cohen is a labor lawyer who specializes in domestic work. The most common complaint she gets from workers is that they have been unjustly terminated, usually following a blow-up. The employers, she explains, tend to explode at perceived affronts or suggestions of personal disloyalty. I think it comes from this idea that the domestic worker is the employer's chattel, Cohen speculates. She paid for the worker, the employer is getting a life. When the domestic worker shows that she has her own life, her own problems, her own health, and her own kids to attend to, it's threatening. Suddenly it's clear that the worker has concerns that are more important than taking care of some employer's house or kids. One of Cohen's recent cases involved a Guatemalan live-in who worked for a stay-at-home mother with school-aged children. When the live-in fell ill one weekend, she called in sick from her weekend residence. According to Cohen, the employer became incensed and commanded her to come immediately. She refused and she was fired. The employers immediately stopped payment on her last paycheck. Many live-in nannies and housekeepers erroneously believe that they are entitled to national holidays such as Memorial Day and Labor Day. They are often summarily fired when they return to their jobs. For this reason, the domestic employment agencies brim with new job seekers after holiday weekends. Conflicts over pay and requests for raises also spark abrupt firings. Cohen recently represented a woman who worked as a live-in at one place for 7 years, earning $130 a week, which was well below minimum wage. When the employer added the care of a sick stray dog to her regular list of duties, which already included tending to several animals, the employee asked for a raise. She was fired. They lose their job and they think there's something wrong when that happens, says Cohen. A lot of domestic workers come in complaining about having been wrongfully terminated. I haven't studied other countries' legal systems, but it appears to me that in other countries, the laws around being terminated from a job and your right to a vacation are a lot more progressive than here. Sociologist Alejandro Portes confirms Cohen's impression. Many third world nations have implemented labor regulations that, on paper at least, have little to envy those of the most advanced countries, says Portes. In Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, it is more difficult to fire a worker with some minimum tenure on the job than in the United States. In the United States, employers can fire or hire whenever they wish, at will, so long as they do not employ discriminatory criteria. Employment at will means both that an employer can legally fire a worker for no reason and with no notice, and that an employee can legally quit without notice. The notion of an equal playing field between employers and employees, however, overlooks the imbalance of power between the two parties. In recent decades, a body of U.S. law called wrongful termination has developed, but it generally applies to rich executives with written contracts that they can prove were breached. Most of Cohen's clients who allege wrongful termination wind up pursuing wage claims. After all, there is not much a lawyer can do to redress a legal, though unpleasant, job termination. But very often, Cohen finds that employers have made illegal deductions from their workers' wages. Nonetheless, whether they come to Cohen seeking a wrongful termination claim or a wage claim, many domestic workers emerge from blow-ups with grievances no lawyer can rectify. The eruption of hostilities, often with longtime employers whose lives the workers know intimately well, can be emotionally wounding. The loss of contact with children domestic workers help to raise can be nothing short of heartbreaking. And the fact of being fired on the spot, which may also mean being cast out of one's home, bruises the pride of many workers, especially when, like Elvira, they find themselves casting about for lodging and work without references and without roots in the communities where they have landed. Quitting through alibis and other fictions. Weekly house cleaners and the employers rarely experience blow-ups, in part because they only see each other once a week, twice a month, or perhaps not at all. When they do meet, it is typically for fleeting moments during which it is relatively easy to remain cordial. Since the house cleaner's duties do not include child care, employer-employee relations are less complex and less volatile. Problems do arise, and when that happens, house cleaners and their employers prefer to exit the arrangement with discretion. Some house cleaners leave jobs by calling in sick a few times or by relying on a time-tested alibi. My mother is sick and I must immediately return home to Guatemala. The alibi is so well used that some Latina domestic workers joke about it, recalling with laughter their dramaturgical efforts. Lies and alibis are popular exit strategies for nannies and housekeepers, as well as for house cleaners. One domestic worker, Gladys Vargas, recalls about a year ago, a friend of mine who was working as a housekeeper for a bachelor says to me, "Look, I'm going to Miami, but I have to tell the señor that I'm going back to Honduras, because what if something is missing? And then another thing, and then he calls the police. That would make her life impossible, so it's just easier to say that she's going to Honduras to be with her sick children, even though she's going to Miami for a better job." As subordinates in her relationships marked by asymmetries of race, nationality, citizenship, language, and class, many domestic workers are not accustomed to expressing face-to-face criticism to their superiors. In fact, they fear retribution for doing so. A domestic employee who tells her employer that she is leaving because she has a better job prospect or because she was dissatisfied with her job may be accused of betrayal and disloyalty. She may be accused of theft, justly or unjustly. She may fear that the former employee will call the immigration authorities in retaliation, or she may fear that by quitting verbally, she will ignite the flame of an unpleasant verbal encounter. Employers often know that quitting alibis are lies. Several of the employers I spoke with laughingly recalled seeing their former housekeepers, women who supposedly had to leave abruptly to visit sick or dying relatives, days or weeks later. When a house cleaner calls in sick for a few days and then just disappears, the employer may interpret her behavior as typical of a lazy, unmotivated Latina immigrant, not a disgruntled employee who is unhappy with her working conditions. As Julia Wrigley, the author of Other People's Children, notes, AWOL workers are sending their employers a message, but it is not a message employers always choose to understand. Employers, meanwhile, are not much better at firing domestic workers than the workers are at quitting. Typical employer alibis include extended trips, home remodeling, or the return of a former employee. Many employers find it very difficult either to directly fire a worker or to constructively communicate job deficiencies in ways that might allow the employee to improve. Teresa Portillo, a weekly house cleaner, made the mistake of offering to do the laundry one week. Thereafter, the employer anticipated that she would do the laundry every time. Teresa explained that their original agreement did not entail her staying until the dryer cycles were completed, but the employer left her a note saying that she would dock Teresa's pay by $5 each time she left clothes in the dryer. Teresa solved the problem. She simply stopped going to that job. Lupe Velez had a full route of houses to clean. One employer accused her of scratching an old used stove. "I finished cleaning that house, but my eyes were swollen from crying over that stove that I hadn't scratched. I went home and I didn't return." Elizabeth Mapplethorpe fired her last maid, a young Latina woman, because she couldn't properly cook and serve a formal dinner for 6. Yet she never communicated this grievance to the employee. In spite of Mrs. Mapplethorpe's years of experience with domestic employees, her ample social graces, and her seemingly unflappable confidence in hierarchy and in communicating directives, she wasn't quite sure how to handle the situation. She sought advice from the domestic employment agency that had initially made the placement, but the agency counseled her to tell the woman that a former housekeeper was returning. That's what Mrs. Mapplethorpe did. Bonnie Feinstein, who employs a rotating group of cleaners, housekeepers, and nannies, is extremely dissatisfied with 2 women in her crew, particularly her weekly house cleaner, Sarita. She started to come to iron, and she didn't have any other work, and so then I let her start cleaning, Mrs. Feinstein explains. "She's not a very good cleaner, and she's not a very good ironer, but I just haven't been able to fire her," she chuckles. "So I just haven't fired her. I just stick with someone like Sarita who is not perfect rather than make a change." But Mrs. Feinstein does not intend to stick with Sarita indefinitely. "We're going to go away next month, and I've told her that I'm thinking about changing things around and that we're waiting to hear about this thing my husband is doing in France," she says. "I'll use that as an excuse." Asked if she had ever told Sarita that her cleaning was not up to par, Mrs. Feinstein laughed and replied, "No, I know I should, but I just haven't." In fact, Sarita's cleaning was so substandard that even the other household employees had complained about it to Mrs. Feinstein. She told them to handle it among themselves. Mrs. Feinstein's across-the-street neighbor, Julia Thomas Ahib, also employed Sarita, and she acted with less ambivalence. One day, Mrs. Thomas Ahib came home to find Sarita in her house cleaning when she was not scheduled to do so. Miss Thomas Ahib expressed her anger, but Sarita remained unflustered. At that point, recalls Miss Thomas Ahib, I said, "You know, I really have to think about this, and I'll let you know when I want you to come back." She did her own house cleaning for 8 months, and then just before hosting a party at her home, she called Sarita. Sarita, she reported, returned to clean and acted as though nothing had even ever happened between them. While not all employers are as diffident about communicating displeasure as Mrs. Feinstein, and while few would resume employing someone after a transgression, there is a strong preference among employers for staying with an imperfect house cleaner who is a known quantity. Most employers prefer this to a confrontation or to the hassle of seeking a replacement. When they do decide to fire someone, they rarely do it straightforwardly. What blow-ups, excuses, and other exits say about domestic work. Domestic work, especially when it involves childcare, produces relationships that fall somewhere between family and employment, yet are often regarded as neither. Caught betwixt and between, the domestic worker also finds herself on the losing end of a highly asymmetrical balance of power and privilege between employer and employee. Taken together, these conditions comprise a recipe for abuse and abrupt job endings. Many Latina immigrant employees and their U.S. employers fall easily into a familial rhetoric, referring to the worker as just like one of the family. Indeed, this attitude has a long history in paid domestic work, and as many analysts have noted, it helps blur the boundaries between paid work and unpaid favors, which in turn often leads to exploitation. Contemporary employers in Los Angeles, however, sound markedly different from their predecessors. In fact, many of them regard their domestic workers with a new distance and sterility. It's the employees, meanwhile, who want personal recognition from their employers. But they do not want to be taken for granted like members of the employer's own family, or to be expected to perform their duties solely out of love for their employer's children. Rather, they want consideration, understanding, and acknowledgement that they have lives and families of their own. The complexity of domestic employment arrangements begins with the very nature of the work involved. Providing daily care for children or the elderly is a personal and idiosyncratic affair. Not only that, but as policy analyst Deborah Stone has noted, care work is inherently relational, whether it consists in routine bodily care such as bathing and feeding, or an emotional attachment, affiliation, and intimate knowledge. Parents who hire nannies and housekeepers want employees who will really care about and show preference for their children. Yet, such personal engagement remains antithetical to how we normally think about employment. In fact, it can be hard for employers to acknowledge that the domestic employee has her own family life and is in fact tenderly caring for and cooing over the employee's children because she needs the cash. Nannies do form genuine bonds of affection with some of the children in their care, but this does not obviate their need for a living wage and decent working conditions. Moreover, the nannies who open their hearts to the children they care for often express bewilderment, hurt, and rage when the children's parents then treat them with little regard. Many employers go out of their way to minimize interactions with their domestic employees, but Latina immigrant women, especially those who look after children, crave personal contact. The distant employer-employee relations that prevail today exacerbate inequality by denying domestic workers even the modest forms of social recognition that help shore up a worker's dignity and provide emotional sustenance. The job exits detailed above are not just tales of personal distress or relational conflict. They are also missed opportunities for occupational reform. Many years ago, the development economist Albert O. Hirschman observed that consumers express dissatisfaction with company products by either exiting the relationship and buying their goods elsewhere, or by voicing complaints. The former is a good deal easier than the latter. Exiting an economic relationship requires neither verbal skill nor negotiating savvy, and it practically ensures that everyone concerned will be spared messy, complex, and unpleasant interactions. The asymmetries endemic to paid domestic work encourage the painless exit. For both employers and employees, quiet dismissals and alibis are neater, more manageable, less offensive, and thus preferable to heated, honest exchanges. Over time, the accumulation of these quiet exits can lead to explosive blow-ups. One thing clearly lost amid both the repression and the explosions is the opportunity to exchange constructive criticism. Another is the chance to substantially reform the occupation. As the global marketplace for paid domestic workers expands, it cries out for new models of employment. Like all workers, domestic employees have families, concerns, and aspirations of their own. But unlike other workers, nannies and housekeepers tend to face employers who feel threatened by their outside emotional commitments. While we cannot legislate that employers care about their workers' personal lives, we can strive to make domestic work an occupation that allows employees to maintain their dignity as well as their family and social ties. We could begin with a living wage, benefits, and the simple recognition that domestic work can be both a job and an avocation, one deserving of respect, consideration, and constructive engagement, whether critical or otherwise. And that is the end of that chapter. So thank you for joining me. Bye.